Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Life of the Mind, Interdisciplinary Conversations with UC faculty. So I am Jenny Doctor, head of the College-Conservatory of Music Library, the Albino Gorno Memorial Library. And on behalf of my fellow Life of the Mind steering committee members, I thank you for joining us today as we celebrate UC faculty research, scholarship, and creative output. Before I introduce our speaker, Professor Stephen Meyer, I would like to take a moment to recognize the Life of the Mind steering committee who planned and organized today's event. In addition to myself, those members include co-chairs Cynthia Ris and Dean Shimo Wang, Caleb Adler, Yonatan Ayo, Helene Hart, Michael Sharp, Jenny Makowitz, and Melissa Cox-Norris. So, Life of the Mind is a semi-annual lecture series that features a distinguished UC faculty member presenting his or her work of and expertise. There's one in the spring and there's one in the fall each year. So just to give you a sense of how today's going to work, after Professor Meyer concludes his remarks this afternoon, a panel of UC faculty members, also very distinguished, will respond to and discuss the lecture from diverse perspectives. The aim is for the lecture's ideas and the respondents' points of view to engage you in the audience to take part in further discussion. So that's the format of today's event, and now it is my very great pleasure to present to you today's Life of the Mind faculty presenter, Stephen Meyer, professor of musicology in the College-Conservatory of Music. Steve has diverse research interests, specializing in 19th century opera, epic film music, and he is currently editing a collection of essays in music and medievalism. Steve is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Music History Pedagogy, an area to which he continues to make pioneering contributions. He received his PhD in music history from State University of New York, Stony Brook. He has authored numerous peer-reviewed books, essays, and articles, including his monograph, Epic Sound, Music in Post-War Hollywood Biblical Films, the collection of essays that he edited in 2017, Music in Epic Film, Listening to Spectacle, and the favorite of many, Soundscapes of Middle-earth, the question of medievalist music in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. So, the title of Professor Meyer's talk today is Beyond Decanonization, the Future of Humanities in the Neoliberal University. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Steve Meyer.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'd like to begin just by thanking my colleagues and my students in CCM. One of the things that I'm going to be talking about and advocating for here is a more community-based approach to humanities scholarship, and I'd like to say that this talk is the result of that. So thank you. As the father of two teenage sons, I have been continually confronted by the great divide that seems to separate the fantasy literature of their generation from that of my own youth. I escaped from my painfully awkward nerdishness with books such as The Hobbit. Help me out here. Somebody help. That's my painfully awkward nerdishness right there. I'll just continue and we can figure it out. So my painfully awkward nerdishness was books like The Hobbit, Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea series, the Prydwen novels of Lloyd Alexander. All of these epic stories were set in vaguely medievalist fantasy worlds. So we getting up there? Okay, there we are. All right. Here. Bottom arrow, that's going to help me and not escape. Okay. The fantasy literature of my son's generation, by contrast, is far more likely to unfold in a beleaguered dystopian landscape. So well established is this trend that Amazon.com, that universal arbiter of cultural taste, now has a separate category for teen and young adult, oh, it's this way, right? There we go. Teen and young adult dystopian books. Okay, so literature about the future of the humanities, I am sorry to say, seems to have taken a trajectory similar to the one traced by teen and young adult literature. Although certain key works, such as Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, or Alan Bloom's Jeremiad, The Closing of the American Mind, adumbrate the dystopian tone of current books about the state of the humanities, they are somewhat isolated examples. The literature on this subject has now become overwhelming. My recent search for, quote, the future of humanities in the Neoliberal University, end quote, yielded 17,800,000 hits. Obviously, I cannot claim to have done anything more than skim across the surface of this list. Even a cursory glance through its contents, however, reveals a predominant affect. The future of the humanities is at best extremely troubled. In the most dire discussions of this topic, the humanities are simply doomed to rapid and inevitable extinction. In the Hunger Games arena of the Neoliberal University, we are going to be the first of the tributes to be killed. It is perhaps only the diminished purchasing power of the American professoriate which has discouraged the tastemakers at Amazon from setting up a special department for books and articles about the futures of the humanities. If they were ever to do so, however, dystopia would seem to be its only relevant category. My purpose today is not to add to this already saturated marketplace, still less to contribute to the sense of despair that seems to color every discussion about the future of the humanities, both here at UC and in the wider communities in which we work. Instead, I hope to generate fresh discussion of this topic by focusing on one small component of the history of the humanities in the American Academy, namely, the changing role of the music historical canon within my own discipline of musicology. With this in mind, I will begin my talk today with a 30,000-foot view of the, quote, crisis of the humanities, and then use a discussion of my own discipline in order, hopefully, to shed some new light on this dystopian landscape. I wish to approach the crisis in the humanities by identifying three fundamental developments that support and interweave with one another like the three strands of a braided rope. Like the strands of a braid, these developments move in and out of the background as the rope is turned and viewed from different perspectives. The relationship among these developments is not necessarily causal, or rather, claims about causality change depending on how the discussion is framed. The first of these strands, and the most readily apparent, is deinstitutionalization. The shift of resources away from the liberal arts towards the other disciplines is an undeniable fact of life in the 21st century academy. My sons enjoy joking with me about the gigantic new musicology building, aka the new Lindner School of Business, that is being erected to the north of the rec center. The idea that UC should be investing money in a new building for musicology, or for any of the other humanities for that matter, is so far-fetched that it has become comical. The phrase, quote, new musicology building approaches the status of an oxymoron. The most notable consequence of this resource shift is probably not infrastructure, but rather the increasing shift of the instructional workload away from the shrinking number of tenure track lines and onto contingent faculty. The neoliberal paradigm of the 21st century university seems to enforce an inexorable logic. There we go. And according to that logic, The final stage in this process is obviously the elimination of quote-unquote unprofitable majors, programs, and or entire departments. The recent decision by the administration of the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point to close 13 majors is perhaps the most high-profile recent example of this development. I think these got out. Yeah, here we go. I should say that I pulled this off of Inside Higher Ed, and they clearly do not have a filter in their algorithm for excessive irony. You notice the advertisement, Master of Arts in Teaching, right next to the announcement that all these majors are being closed. Okay. Within the genre of dystopian literature about the future of the humanities, this deinstitutionalization is often figured as part of a larger and more nefarious neoliberal agenda. A passage from Henry Giroux's essay, quote, Beyond Dystopian Education in a Neoliberal Society, might serve as an example of this more broadly shared viewpoint. Welcome to the dystopian world of corporate education in which learning how to think, be informed by public values, and become engaged critical citizens are viewed as a failure rather than as a mark of success. Instead of producing a generation of leaders worthy of the challenges, the dystopian mission of public and higher education is to produce robots, technocrats, and compliant workers. Despite, or perhaps because of, its questionable syntax, this passage gives voice to the powerful sense of frustration and discouragement that many of us in the humanities share. Yet I seriously doubt that, quote, producing robots, technocrats, and compliant workers is a part of the strategic plan of UW Stevens Point. It seems far more likely that their decision to close 13 majors was driven instead by declining enrollments, the second strand of my metaphorical braid. The Chronicle of Higher Education recently published an exhaustive survey of chosen majors in United States colleges and universities. I know that this graph is going to be illegible in the back, and I'm sorry about that, but hang on for just a second. History showed the steepest decline, and it's at the bottom there. But other disciplines in the humanities were not far behind. Hopefully you can read that a little bit. So you can see this is the bottom of the graph, a close-up. So history, religion, area studies, et cetera, et cetera. It is hardly surprising that so-called practical degrees appear at the top of the graph. Exercise science saw the greatest growth, followed closely by computer science and nursing. It's curious that music appeared in the middle section of the chart, very close to business. So I'm giving you 0 there. You can see music probably saw 1% growth, something like that. This chart seems to suggest that, at least in the eyes of undergraduate students, music occupies a kind of medial position between popular applied and unpopular theoretical disciplines. I will return to this idea a bit later in my talk. Before I do so, however, I want to introduce the third strand in my metaphorical braid, the one which, at least for the purposes of my talk today, will be the most important. There we go. I refer to the cultural critique of the humanities per se, the idea that they are either irrelevant or else hopelessly compromised by the political agenda of an alienated professoriate. Karen Fisher addresses this cultural critique in a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Let me pull this up here. Fewer than 4 in 10 Republican voters, I think many of you have probably seen the statistic, have confidence in higher ed, a drop of 17 percentage points in just 3 years. When asked by the Pew Research Center, 79% of Republicans cited their unhappiness with professors injecting their political and social opinions into the classroom. So as you saw on the previous slide, this is obviously a big problem in states such as ours that have a Republican state legislature. It's a crisis of legitimacy. And this crisis, as I will hope to demonstrate shortly, is directly related to the process of decanonization that has been underway in my own discipline for several decades now. In order to understand this process, it's necessary to give a bit of background for those of you for whom the history of musicology is not a pressing concern. I know it's hard to believe that, but some people might be in that category. My focus will be on the relationship between musicology and the music historical canon. Needless to say, this latter term has been the focus of much scholarly debate, but for our purposes today, I will take it to mean a group of well-known musical works that were understood to be in some way exemplary. It is not accidental that our term for this group of works, namely canon, is borrowed from theology. For these works, the Passions of Johann Sebastian Bach, the operas of Mozart, the symphonies of Beethoven, and so forth, were understood to have a special kind of authority. As a professional academic discipline, musicology was somewhat late to form. The American Musicological Society was founded in 1942. Just to give you sort of framework for that, College Art Association founded in 1911. I think American Historical Society, I want to say 1884. Okay, so somewhat late in comparison to other academic disciplines. In its early days, as Tamara Levitz points out in a recent article, members of the society studied a wide range of different musics. Oh, there we go. So this is her quote. Indeed, scholars during the early years of the AMS often positioned themselves against the tastes of the music-loving public. The key impulse was to define musicology as a rigorous science dedicated to establishing empirical facts and not simply enhancing the enjoyment of the literature, of the listener. What I would regard as the second phase in the development of our discipline might be traced back to the 1960s and a kind of uneasy alliance between the highbrow science of music and the middlebrow appreciation of the music historical canon. Let me jump to this. There we are. The following image illustrates what we might call the mid-century middlebrow understanding of music history. So this is a image. It's just called A Most Unusual Musical Calendar. It's produced, you can see right there, you can't probably read this, but Otto Eitel, I should say, is not a musicologist. He's the maitre d' at the Bismarck Hotel in Chicago, right? And you can see in black, those are the times, the lifespans of the individual composers. And they start with Bach at the top and end up with Gershwin. Okay. What we might call the academicization of the canon during the post-war period was informed by what I like to call the universalist paradigm. In this paradigm, one of the key aspects of it is that of progress. What I'm showing you here is the bottom. And this shows you the historical dates, right? Washington is the president, et cetera, et cetera. Great inventions. And then the last row is the listening audience that goes from 5,000 in 1700 up until, 100 million. Right? So this sense of inevitable growth, which is tied to the inevitable progress of what was, perhaps it seems nostalgically called Western civilization, right? Things are just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay. So this universalist paradigm that informs this sense of growth has some key elements. First, that the music of what we called the common practice period, essentially the time frame outlined in the unusual musical calendar that I just showed you, was simply better, richer, deeper, more intellectually engaging than other types of music. It follows that this music can still speak to us, that it is, to paraphrase Karl Dahlhaus, both historical and aesthetic. The dual nature of this canonical music is perhaps most evident in monumental works such as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or Mahler's Second. The grandiosity of this music, its exorbitant length, its gigantic performing forces, its universalist themes of transfiguration and transcendence is certainly the product of 19th century Europe. Here I'm showing you the instrumentation for the orchestra of Mahler's Second Symphony. And you can just see its gigantic performing sizes. The German's probably too small for you to read, but it tells you the stringed instruments, and at the end of it, alle in möglichst starke Besetzung. So basically, you should just have as many stringed instruments as you possibly can, right? And going down there, you might notice 10 horn parts, an organ. There's also a choir, which is supposed to have 200 people in it, right? Gigantic performing forces. We might say that these qualities, this is one view, historical, are the natural expression of a culture, 19th century Europe, in the process of subjecting the greater part of the globe to its economic, political, and military power. And yet, if we follow the assumptions of the universalist paradigm, this music transcends the cultural environment in which it was created. Good musicologists can enhance its ability to speak to all people in all times. In this way, they can help to unleash the inherent power of this music to transform individuals as well as societies. Okay. Familiarity with the canon is therefore an essential part of individual cultural formation. As more people absorb good music, moreover, society will potentially be improved and ennobled. So, if I could return to that graph of the unusual musical calendar, it would have a final row on it, which would be something like the goodness of civilization. And it would also be increasing, right? That's the universalist paradigm. These ideas about the transformative and ennobling power of music, of course, are as old as music itself. And I do not want to suggest that musicologists of the 60s and 70s adopted them in a wholehearted or uncritical way. What is important here is not the extent to which musicologists themselves subscribe to this universalist paradigm, but rather the justification that this paradigm provided for the growth of musicology departments and programs during the post-war period. Other disciplines, of course, have also oriented themselves around groups of canonic works. I think especially of art history, but also of English, religion, and philosophy. What distinguishes musicology from its sister disciplines in this regard, however, is the relationship to music performance. In the post-war period and up to the present day, musicologists and performers tend to operate in the same environment. In conservatory settings such as CCM, our students play at least a subset of the works that we teach in our music history classes. It is for this reason, perhaps, that the idea of a canon may have retained a stronger hold on our discipline than in that of other disciplines. Although such things are difficult to date with any precision, I would say that this hold continued well into the 1990s. Many would say that it is still firmly in place today. By the 1980s, however, the hegemony of the traditional canon was being challenged. This challenge was part of what came to be called the new musicology, and it constitutes what I will call the third phase in the history of musicology and its relationship to the canon. Perhaps the simplest way to describe the new musicology, for those of you who aren't musicologists, is simply that it's a reflection of the transformations that affected other humanities disciplines during the 1960s and 70s. In musicology, as in the culture of Cincinnati, everything seems to happen 10 or 20 years after it does everywhere else. Proponents of the new musicology were interested in applying critical theory, feminist perspectives, queer theory, and other new methodologies to the study of music, and their work revolutionized the field. These scholars affected the relationship to the canon in two essential ways. First, they subjected canonical works to new kinds of culturally informed analyses that occasionally upended traditional modes of understanding. Susan McClary, whose 1991 Feminine Ending still stands as a kind of embodiment of the spirit of the new musicology, famously interpreted aspects of Beethoven's symphonic music not as signifiers of transcendence, but rather as expressions of patriarchal dominance and violence. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the new musicologists helped to turn our myopic focus on the works of dead white male composers towards compositions by women and non-white musicians. Some characteristic and seminal works from this period include the 1986 collection Women Making Music, Samuel Floyd's The Power of Black Music, and the Historical Anthology of Music by Women Composers compiled by James Briscoe. The new musicology had its detractors, to be sure, but the predominant affect of the period, I think, was one of excitement and openness. Many musicologists, I think, welcomed the expansion of the canon as a means of correcting the implicit racism and sexism behind its construction. Something of this spirit is captured by Ellen Koskoff in her contribution to the Rethinking Music collection. The recent explosion of postmodern critical theory from musicology, ethnomusicology, gay and lesbian studies, etc. So you can see the sense of openness and expansion that this quotation embodies. Behind this quotation is a kind of implicit correspondence between musical works and communities. Works by lesbian composers are ipso facto linked to lesbians per se. Works by African Americans embody African American identity. The dominance of dead white composers in the canon reflects the race-based patriarchy of the academy and of society at large. By opening the canon, to extend Koskoff's metaphor, we will rescue not simply repertoires, but also social groups from the purgatory of otherness. Expanding the canon could thus lead to a kind of socio-aesthetic utopia in which all underrepresented minorities could have a place at the table. An unspoken assumption, at least for many scholars active during the last decades of the 20th century, was that the advent of this more inclusive world would be accompanied by a slow but steady expansion in the field of musicology. According to this logic, an expanded canon would require an expanded musicology faculty. The bulk of the new positions, to be sure, would be added in ethnomusicology and in popular music studies, but historical musicology, more narrowly constructed, would also continue to expand. Although several departments have indeed been able to add new positions along these lines, the brave, newly expanded world of an inclusive and fully resourced musicology has failed to dawn. Instead, musicology, along with other humanities disciplines, seems caught up in an inexorable ebb tide, one that is driven by cultural forces far beyond the control of a small group of marginalized academics. What I would like to call the process of decanonization, through which the small group of works by dead white male composers loosened its hold on the curriculum, did not in fact lead to an expansion in the number of tenure-track lines or in the size of budgets devoted to musicology. Quite the opposite, in fact. Scholars of the new musicology clearly expose the exclusivity, the racism, and the sexism as it informed what I have called the universal paradigm of the traditional canon. Ironically, this critique may have facilitated the process of deinstitutionalization that has accelerated during the past decade and a half. If music history was no longer justified by the assumptions of the universalist paradigm, it became easier to cut. The fourth stage of my history of musicology and the canon, unfortunately, is not one of inclusivity and expansion, but rather of decline. The universalist paradigms at the heart of the music historical canon were naive at best. At worst, they reflected ideas about the supposed cultural superiority of white men that were in desperate need of deconstruction. Nevertheless, they provided justification for the institutionalization of musicology and its growth during the post-war period. As the cultural power of these universalist paradigms receded, so too, at least in the eyes of many university administrators, did musicology's raison d'être. This observation about the link between decanonization and deinstitutionalization, of course, leads to an obvious question. If the universalist paradigm is no longer valid, how will musicology justify itself? Here I'd like to broaden my focus, for this is a problem that musicology faces along with its sister disciplines in the humanities. I would divide responses to these existential questions into two broad categories. The first of these grows directly from the kind of spirit that informs the quotation from Ellen Koskoff that I just displayed. We might call this the social justice argument. Lifting up marginalized voices, according to this way of thinking, does not merely, quote, fill in overlooked content areas, but actually forms the core mission of the humanities. The idea here is that the ultimate function of the humanities is to help dismantle ideological structures of power and domination. Many of my friends in the humanities subscribe at least to some degree to this basic idea, and vestiges of it survive in the broader discourse about our disciplines. The National Humanities Alliance website, for example, contains a short video featuring Kwame Coleman, a PhD candidate in musicology at Stanford. Sorry, there he is. I got these things out a little bit out of order. Okay. Then NHA is careful not to present Coleman as a radical. The ultimate purpose of the organization, after all, is to advocate for greater NEH funding. Sitting next to a grand piano, in black-framed glasses and a conservative sweater, Coleman is careful not to wave any red flags. Nevertheless, some carefully couched phrases from the video hint at the idea of musicology as social critique. In one place he says this: "I think that the study of jazz brings up a lot of problems that we as Americans are still concerned with, like who we are as a country, as a people. I think that jazz brings up those questions forthright." Coleman's video strikes a chord with me, but I am not the core audience for arguments about the existential worth of the humanities. In the neoliberal paradigm, the ability of the humanities to bring up problems is far less prized than its potential ability to solve them. It is perhaps for this reason that justification for the humanities so often takes a different tack. At least in our current cultural moment, the social justice argument has taken a backseat to a different kind of strategy, one that I will call the instrumentalist argument for the humanities. Let's see if I can get back here. Oops. Somebody help me. Maybe this is again. How do I get back? Thank you. I'm sorry for hitting this. I'll just keep going. Okay. The idea here is that the humanities provide vital training in critical thinking, verbal expression, and analysis, skills that are in high demand in a rapidly changing economy. Perhaps I just want that George Anders there. That's the one. That's good. Yeah. Perhaps the best-known recent expression of this idea comes in the 2017 book, You Can Do Anything, The Surprising Power of a, quote, Useless Liberal Arts Education by George Anders. The idea here is that studying the humanities will open doors to places in the neoliberal economy. This spirit also informs a recent essay by Peter Coy in Forbes. Okay, there we go. Turns out that soft skills aren't so soft after all. New research finds that from 2000 to 2012, jobs that require non-cognitive skills, we'll come back to that, such as the ability to communicate and work in teams, grew much faster, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Coy is trying to show the relevance of the humanities for the neoliberal economy, but the very fact that he labels communication skills as soft and non-cognitive suggests a fundamental dissonance, one that the instrumentalist argument fails to address. I will approach this dissonance by describing my own experience with a program at Syracuse University, where I was on the faculty of the Department of Art and Music Histories. For several years during my tenure at Syracuse, I was the faculty advisor for the Winston Fisher Seminar Program. Winston Fisher graduated with a BA in philosophy from Syracuse and went on to run a large family corporation. Each year, Winston Fisher sponsored a group of students to spend spring break in New York, meeting other Syracuse alumni and familiarizing themselves with the corporate culture of the city. On the final day of the program, students would present an original business plan to a group of executives, who would then award a $500 prize to the student whose plan seemed to be the best. The program was only open to students in the College of Arts and Sciences, and it sent a clear message that a degree in the liberal arts could lead to a prestigious and well-paid position in the corporate world of steel and glass. Here they are in front of a fish tank. The problem is that the humanities are not only about what Coy calls the soft and non-cognitive skills that this corporate world prizes. They are also about critique. When I half-humorously made the observation that the maintenance on the 3,000-gallon fish tank that forms the background in this photo would go a long ways towards funding a new position in my department, my little joke was not well received. The next year, somebody else was chosen to be the faculty advisor for the program. My argument here is not that either the social justice or the instrumentalist argument is wrong. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think that we need to make both of these arguments as strongly as we can. They are necessary, but they are not sufficient. What I would like to suggest this afternoon is that we look back to the universalist paradigm for perspectives on our future. I am not interested, I should say, in reinstituting the canon of the unusual musical calendar that I showed you a few minutes ago. I am not trying to make musicology great again. But I am interested in thinking about what the canon and the universalist paradigm gave to musicologists of the post-war period, apart from a justification for their existence. Two things seem especially important to me. First, the canon served as a group of common texts with which most musicologists were generally familiar. The fact that so many musicologists had such long and rich relationships with canonical works helped to create a sense of common purpose and identity. The fact that these works were susceptible to so many different interpretations provided a sense that new discoveries and insights were right around the corner. A second element seems to be, if anything, more important. This is the idea that the works of the canon and the patterns of thought in which they were enmeshed had an intrinsic beauty that transcended applicability. So we wanted to study Beethoven, we might say, not because it's going to expose patterns of patriarchal dominance, not because it's going to give us transferable skills that we're going to be able to use to get a job in middle management, but because it was beautiful, right? That fundamental idea. Studying the canon was valuable not because it could teach transferable skills that might be valued in the world of work, but precisely because it could cultivate a sense of being outside of that world. The question, it seems to me, is how to retain these positive aspects of the universalist paradigm in a post-canonical age. I do not have the answer, but I am most encouraged by what feels like a glimmering realization that the neoliberal paradigm, in which everything is potentially an object of transaction, is not enough. That in order for our democracy and even for our planet to survive, we must uncover or recover a different set of values. It is here, I think, that the humanities finds its work and its justification. With apologies to Peter Coy, there is little in this work that is soft, still less non-cognitive. And yet, I believe that we will meet its intellectual and spiritual challenges. Thank you.
For your insightful and provocative comments. I learned a lot about musicology today.
More than you wanted to know.
More than I ever thought I'd want to know. But being from the English discipline, I also know about the canon. and questions about which text, which author, how to prioritize that. But I think, as you very astutely said, it's not so much about prioritizing a particular text. It's prioritizing the ability to continue in this university that we live in and work in, the study of all texts, of all musical works, of all of the disciplines within the humanities, and to continue to be able to treat that as a serious study. So thank you very much. That's really got me thinking, and I know it's going to get our panelists thinking, and hopefully our audience thinking. I am Cynthia Ris, by the way. I'm the chair of the Faculty Senate. I'm also co-chair of the Life of the Mind Committee. And I did want to say my co-chair, Jimo Wang, could not be here today, and he wanted me to send his regrets for the unavoidable conflict that he had. So as Jenny had said earlier, our presentation will continue with more conversation. So at this point, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists as they walk up to the table up there. It's going to be very dramatic. And so we're going to start with Alberto Espay, if you'd like to. We're doing this a little bit differently just because of the mic issue. Professor Espay is professor of neurology at the College of Medicine. Welcome. Thank you. Next is James Mack, professor of chemistry, College of Arts and Sciences, and also associate dean in the graduate school. Tamika Odum, assistant professor, behavioral sciences, UC Blue Ash. Welcome, Tamika. And Rebecca Williamson, associate professor, architecture and interior design at the College of Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning. Welcome to all of you. As you know, Life of the Mind is meant to provoke discussion and an open exchange of ideas, not only with those ideas that we agree with, but those that we sometimes disagree with. Short of throwing chairs, I'm going to invite that kind of robust conversation, both from the panelists and then after the panelists present, from the audience as well. So to begin discussion, Professor Espay will give a brief response to Professor Meyer's talk. He will be followed immediately by Professors Mack, Odum, and Williamson in that order. After their responses, I'll open the floor for audience comments and questions. Panelists, as you know, you've been asked to keep your responses to approximately 7 minutes so that we have time for discussion afterwards. I understand that Professor Espay will have to leave early. Is that still correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so if anybody's in the middle of a comment or question from the floor and he gets up to leave, please do not take that personally. It's just that he has to leave early. So Professor Espay, would you please lead us off?
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I must admit that the discussion that you're encouraging us to move into is not one that I have had. And so from my perspective, it's creating some analogies that perhaps are somewhat away from the areas that you've raised, but in some other way may be connected. To me, what resonated throughout your presentation was a bit of the disconnect in language, and of course music being a language, but in general the language of some in viewing musicology in a given way versus in a, might I say, practical way. And perhaps that analogy that you put at the beginning with the types of books that you grew up with versus the book that now have come to the fore and define a younger generation, at the core may represent different communication values. And it's quite interesting to think that we are living a bit of a dissonant world in so many levels, and perhaps none more interesting, intriguing than the way we all communicate. some of us are still living in a world of printed letters, and some cannot even imagine a printed world. Books are shifting in terms of the way that they are conveying to us all sorts of information. So some of the ways in which I'm looking at this is whether it may be related to a form of communication that's clashing with another, and that perhaps the core elements may still be there in some way or another, but because the communication level is so different, it seems as if we're losing the original canons. Is it that we are in some level because we're different, because our values have changed? Or is it that what we are communicating or how we are communicating has changed some of that value, the values that we see in that kind of endeavor? In some ways, I think that the different stories you weaved around the past versus the present are metaphors that apply to many disciplines, including medicine. And if I may, I just briefly tell you what our change is today. It's also a language change, but essentially we define diseases on the way they have made sense to us for so long, right? We looked at things and they seemed to us as if they should be representing a disease. And over the years, we've defined diseases in that way. But now we have different other forms of language that speak to us in a very different manner. And they are, a lot of them, technology mediated. We have languages that are telling us about DNA and so many different ways of reading back the genetic codes. And we're looking then back at individuals in front of us with different eyes because the way now we understand them, by virtue of the language of new technologies that now we have to, in some level, try to make sense of, speaks of a different nature. The individuals are the same, but our conception about them has changed. So I would wonder if language and communication in a more broad manner is what we are really dealing with here, and it might create the appearance of a separation between the old and the new, as opposed to perhaps a reconfiguration of things based on information that now we're acquiring that wasn't there to begin with. I think I'm going to leave it at that. I have a few other ideas that I'd like to, if time allows, discuss, but that sort of was the way I could get to your theme. And I apologize, of course, because your area of expertise is ostensibly far away from mine. But I think that you made a few points that certainly resonated with me quite well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Espay. Dr. Meyer?
Not this tall. So, thank you, Steve, for such an interesting presentation. I've got 4 perspectives. I think I look at this from a very unique perspective. I'm a chemist, so that's one perspective. I went to undergraduate at Middlebury College, small liberal arts school in Vermont. So I have a very keen interest in the liberal arts and humanities, and they mandated that you take a lot of things. So I come at it from that perspective. I also come at it from a natural scientist or physical scientist perspective that I guess people would say I'm the opposite side of the fence. So not even in the life sciences. I'm all the way on the other side. So I come from that perspective as well. I also come from the perspective of an African American from a lower socioeconomic group. So I come from that perspective. And then the last perspective I come from an administrative perspective. So I come from that perspective. So you get all the different types of perspectives that you see. So from a Middlebury College perspective, I'll tell you right now, I would not be the scientist I am today without my liberal arts background. The English, the music, and all the things they made me do. And this was a clear place of making you do it, which I did not understand at the time. Philosophy and religion, all of those things. I had no idea what that would mean for my career. I would say I use that every day of my life. And to the scientists I talk to and have conversation with, it's very frustrating when they do not have that background, because I can't get as far as I would like to. There are certain things they don't know that I assumed everybody would know, especially if they went to MIT or Caltech or something like that. Wildly frustrating that way. So that's from that perspective. From my scientist perspective, I understand on one angle of having to prove yourself or explain yourself constantly, because I'm in a field of grantsmanship and grant writing. And that's all that is, of saying, what is your value today as opposed to what it was 3 years ago? So every 3 years, you have to generate new value. And if you're not able to do that, you won't be able to conduct research, you won't be able to move on. And that's a culture of the field, and that's something that we've all had to do. And so I've just understood that that's the nature of the business. And one could say everyone should have to do something like that. I also know that I could not give a lecture about my discipline in this audience and have everyone pay attention and understand what I'm talking about. So I'm also used to people not understanding what I'm talking about. I'm an organic chemist, so a lot of students come to my class. They spend 3 hours a week for 16 weeks, so that's so many hours, and they still only know 10% of the material, as if I didn't say a word. So I'm very familiar with that, and I understand my colleagues in the social sciences and humanities have no idea. What do you mean they don't understand? You must be a horrible teacher if they don't know what you're talking about for that period of time. So I come at it from that perspective. From the perspective of an African American from a lower socioeconomic group, a lot of the fields, when I went to Middlebury College, it was clear to me that I was not included in the discussion. It was clear that they understood a lot of these things, and what I wanted to do or what I thought was good clearly didn't measure up. I was expected to know certain things that I simply did not know, and it was, how dare you not know that? So you did not invite me to know. One of the things that I came in, I was 17 years old, I come from New York, and I liked hip-hop. And so I come in, and they're listening to Led Zeppelin, and I was like, what's that? And I said, what do you mean you don't know what that is? Do you know what Public Enemy is? Well, no one needs to know what Public Enemy is. Okay, so now there's a differentiation, there's a hierarchy at stake, but the groups that had the power got to decide what success looked like. They got to decide what was good. They got to decide all of those things, and it was on their turf. Now you have a situation where those groups are now going to college where they did not go to college before. So you have students in lower socioeconomic groups that does not know the bourgeoisie or the aristocracy or things of that sort. And there's some expectation that they're supposed to just know what it is. They don't. And so they're revolting, and they're saying, I don't see the value in doing that unless you explain it to me. And if you don't want to explain it to me, I'll go do something else that I do see the value in. For example, we all get sick, so I see the value in health. Gravity exists, so I see the value in physics. So we all have to be subject to some of these things. So drugs and pills and chemistry and the things that students are going into, they understand the value of those things because it affects everybody around the globe. For some of the humanities, because the rubrics were set so long ago, there's a disconnect between the lower socioeconomic groups or the first-generation college student and what has happened so long ago that, yes, you have to explain to them what the value is. From an administrator standpoint, you do have to make the university run. And so if you have a large number of students that are clamoring for some aspect of education, you're trying the best way you can to explain to them the value of certain things, but I am not the best person to say the value of a history degree or musicology or English and so on and so forth, especially as a chemist. That would be as hypocritical as possible. And so we would need faculty in those disciplines to explain those types of things to those students, but the faculty say, I shouldn't have to. And so from an administrative standpoint, we're left balancing, okay, you don't feel like you need to. The student's simply not going to know. And so something has to happen because they're going to leave and go to some place that will give them what they want or show them that value. I have other thoughts, but I'll stop there and then I think Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Mack.
I think it's
I'll go with Tamika Odum
Done.
for 100.
So my remarks are prepared. Oh, I have to speak into that? Okay. There we go. Oh, that's really close. Does that like right there?
Yeah.
Okay. So I prepared my remarks ahead of time. I am a talker, and I know myself, and I will talk for minutes and hours on end, and so bear with me as I reflect on my response to the talk. Thank you, Dr. Meyer, for your eloquent demonstration of such an important issue that stands to shape the very fabric of our institution if we are not proactive in our approach to addressing inequality in the academy. I was asked today to provide a response to Dr. Meyer's talk, and more specifically to respond to the question of how do we address structures of inequality in determining next steps for the humanities. It is my hope that my remarks will help in contributing to the conversation of hope and change that we so desperately need in our world today. Higher education has been seen as what some would refer to as the great equalizer, an institution which paves the way for many to achieve social mobility, power, and prestige, an institution that values the diverse makeup of our world. And many believe that higher education, in essence, serves as a symbolic leveling of the playing field. However, we know that racism and classism, sexism, homophobia, and other oppressive systems are deeply embedded within the social structure, and therefore the decanonization of the humanities as it became more inclusive seems inevitable due to the very structure of the institution. When I reflect on next steps, my first response is tear that sucker down. Of course, dismantling the system is what we need to happen in order for real change to occur. But how does one dismantle the system while simultaneously protecting what is good and right with the institution? I'm drawn to the concept of public musicology, as it closely resembles what we in the field of sociology refer to as public sociology. Tamara Levitt writes, public musicology appears as a less disputed solution than the curriculum change to the problem of musicology's exclusionary elitism, the move outward seemingly smoother than any attempt at internal change. Could public musicology be exactly what we need to reposition ourselves within a neoliberal university? The academy today is encouraging academics to participate in more public engagement. This public engagement is what has and will shape the core values of the discipline and the values the institution assigns to the field. The notion of public musicology and public sociology are not new concepts or practices. The need for the discipline to engage in public discourse is significant regardless of the time period. Nevertheless, during significant times of struggle, which we are currently in, the need for public discourse becomes greater. It is important to recognize that we are fighting within an institution and a system that was designed to maintain power structures, not dismantle them. Therefore, how do you fight a system that seemingly values what it identifies as profitable and applicable disciplines that is, disciplines that contribute to maintaining the power structure as opposed to valuing the academy as a whole, comprised of disciplines simultaneously working together to create a society working for the greater good. The academy and the public have often been placed at odds with one another, and now is a great time to embrace the unification of the two worlds as a collective to help shape our institution. In its most practical sense, the decanonization of the humanities, that is, the declining significance of the field, can be attributed in part to the process of dismantling the system. As the canon became more diverse, its significance weakened. But this is a symptom of the system and not a reflection of the value. I do not believe the answer rests in focusing more on how we are so-called profitable and applicable. Indeed, the humanities are profitable and applicable. Sorry about that. But this isn't the fight that we should be fighting. We need to continue to dismantle the system by working collectively with the people to shape the field in a way that gives power to those it represents. An increased focus on shaping public musicology has promised, and I welcome further exploration of its significance to the field. Dr. Meyer, your talk helped me to reflect on the power of public engagement and the power it has in shaping the institution. We are experiencing social change at this very moment, and this notion of decline or a perceived lessening of significance makes sense, but we must continue to shape the discipline in a way that reflects the people. Drawing on Marx, I'm reminded that even the change process is oppressive, as the elite still exist and maintain power. Therefore, dismantling the system will take time and be characterized by struggle. The gains of those with less power are the result of political structure and not the goodwill of the institution. And therefore, it is our responsibility to stay the course, engage the community, and create a public discourse that values the humanities as vital to the betterment of society. Thank you again, Dr. Meyer, for offering your intriguing insights on such a timely topic. I look forward to engaging in riveting conversation from diverse perspectives that will help us to think more intimately about how we might reposition ourselves in a post-canonic and transformational society.
Thank you, Professor Odum. And last but not least, Professor Williamson.
Well, thank you also for the opportunity to do this and the opportunity to get into the weeds on the bureaucratic history of the American Musicological Society, with which I was unfamiliar, and it was kind of boring until Adorno and Albert Einstein showed up in the middle of it. But the paper is based off of archival research in primary documents, including Adorno's application to join the society, and it reminded me of my own forays into academic bureaucratic history or institutional bureaucratic history in preparing a book on 300 years of architectural education in North America. I had the opportunity to read every word of the minutes of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture from 1912 up until I started recognizing names and decided that there were people I knew and I probably shouldn't be reading anymore. And so one of the things that popped up was June 1970, the last page of the minutes of that meeting. The necrology announces with regret the passing of 6 names. I'll just read the first 3 because you'll know them. The others are known to architects: Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Richard Neutra. Then paste the next, that's resolution number 19, or the necrology is number 19 on the agenda. Number 20 is resolved that the ACSA is going to accept the Black minority statement that had been issued at the 1969 AIA ACSA Teachers Seminar. And the Black minority statement is too long to read here, but at one point they say, the minority community in this country has been studied to death. In effect, you must stop using black communities as guinea pigs in the training of your white professionals. We resent any minority community being used as a training ground and a vehicle for gaining university research funding, which aids the university and not the community. And then it goes on to have some requests. This is 50 years ago. So it's rather striking. And it's also striking to see that the names, if you recognize the architects' names, these are the old guard. The rest of the names are more known for pedagogy, in fact, they're teachers. So in listening to some of the talk and then some of the comments, we have some dilemmas in front of us. You know, the word that comes to mind, the expression is the French expression fleur de peau. They say it means you're sort of very sensitive. I think we're in a phase where we all feel very sensitive and very anguished about certain things that we've become aware of. And we just became aware of a couple weeks ago that blackface was still happening in the 80s, and then realized it didn't stop in the 80s. It's a period of heightened sensitivity. And what I'm going to try to do here is sort of tease out the structures that we're operating in. So I see us as individuals working in a kind of triangle between our community affiliation, our institutional affiliation, and our disciplinary or professional or field affiliations, and those words are used differently for different groups. And James really that was the outline of how he talked about his own experience, you know. So, and my field, architecture, is both part of the humanities and not part of the humanities. It's a profession and a discipline. I don't know if that happens in your fields, but in our fields we debate the profession to discipline question quite a bit, and now have come to settle on field as more neutral. And so the institutions probably parallel a lot of other institutions in terms of to understand that things like the musicological society that's much discussed here and that seems to influence your work. It's a construction. It's a 20th century construction, so it doesn't go back to the dawn of time. It's not nature. It's something we decided to construct. Within architecture, first of all, the universities come out of the civil. A lot of stuff happens with wars. War seems to provoke stuff. So the universities, this is a kind of different history here, but the land grants are coming out of the Civil War. Architectural education starts in the United States with the Civil War, getting a professional degree as a kind of formal institutional structure. There are ways to learn previously, and those ways to learn, by the way, were relatively diverse. So there's certainly many, for instance, many instances of African American builders that are well known. They were architects, but they didn't go to school, you know. But that's documented. So the ACSA starts around the time of just right before, on the eve of World War I, and is immediately taken up with how do we as an institution deal. So ACSA, again, Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. But how do we deal with the war? How do we respond to that? What's our role there, and what's happening to the schools? Accreditation seems to, from what I can tell, and sort of data gathering happens around World War II when we're starting to have, you know, IBM and things like that. Cold War, we start looking at research. We start talking about research in a more pointed way. And we also start worrying about the student problem. That actually is how it was put, because already in the 50s there's activism. The 60s with Whitney Young was the one, he spoke to AIA and chided their architects on their resounding irrelevance. And that's AIA 1968, so lots is happening. So we want to become relevant somehow. We're groping for how to become relevant. In fact, it's the social sciences that our architects start to embrace the social sciences as a mandate. And each of these strands that comes in, by the way, doesn't necessarily die. It just sort of comes into the foreground. When I was in school in the 80s, there was a film, I never saw it, but it was called The Right Stuff. It was about fighter pilots. And it was a really macho field, and it kind of felt like you had to have the right stuff, and it was not very welcoming. A lot of horrible stuff happened, in fact. So, it was the era of the New York Five, the Starkitects, et cetera. We produced some of those architects, by the way. And then through the 90s, we had a kind of proliferation of theory that went along with the ability to produce a lot of publications, and I think it must have gone along with promotion and tenure criteria, that you produce this encouragement to produce a certain amount of verbiage. As French theorists became translated, they would suddenly be the latest thing, even if it was 20 or 30 years after they'd actually written, and they were writing about different contexts. So that proliferated, and then we started to get more interested in applied technological questions, and now what's going on the last few months is everybody's starting to say, well, theory died, architecture theory died, what happened? So I'm just going to try to short circuit this thing because I, like everybody else, I have lots of thoughts. But so in my own work, I teach the canon, the architectural canon. I teach there was a course that was called Sources of Modern Architectural Theory when I came here, and it started with Vitruvius and ended with Le Corbusier. And it was snippets of each of them to rush through in a semester. The students would read a little paragraph and see some slides. And what I did to resolve what I saw as a terrible superficiality of that and misleading, leading people to generalizations, is to stretch it out over 2 semesters and to really read the primary sources in all their sexism, in all their racism. It makes you very uncomfortable. Sometimes it's not happy reading, but they are saying what they're saying. But also to start looking at the non-Western texts. And there are Chinese texts, there are Arabic and Persian texts, and so we bring those in too. And also to ask the question of the non-documentary transmission of knowledge and the undocumented roles that exist. And that's the communication question that was brought up earlier. If you're going to study only the documents and only certain documents, then you're going to kind of generalize about them, you're going to get a superficial understanding. But if you're willing to take the plunge into archives and into other cultures and learn languages, and that's where one of the bureaucratic things that happened here was they eliminated the language requirement. Well, learning some language helps you get outside your skin. It's dépaysement, you get defamiliarized. So in my own work, that's what I try to do, is to push towards digging back deeper into into the inherited works, but not seeing them as canon. They're just things we've inherited.
Thank you. Thank you very much, panelists. Now is the audience participation part of our conversation, and we do mean that. We would love to hear not just your questions, but your comments. If you do have questions and they are geared toward one of our panelists, that's fine. You might want to ask them all to respond to a question. I'm going to move the chair here so that our main presenter can join the panelists, and they can all be grilled as audience members. If you do want to make a comment, if you could just raise your hand, I will come around with the mic. I have to be a little circuitous because I have to avoid that thing there that's going to give me feedback. So I saw your hand first. It's like in a classroom. There's yours and then yours. So I'm going to come down here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very thought-provoking papers. And I was struck at the end that all your contributions showed how important the humanities are, because you all, in your ways, talked about changes in these disciplines, paradigm changes, right? And intriguingly, and not so surprisingly, they are similar in all of our fields. I'm in history. You're looking at history in new ways. You're looking at different actors and agency and all of these things. And how do you grapple with these paradigm shifts if you don't have this humanities training of critical thinking, analysis, and that sort of thing? You have to be working with something to actually then challenge it and replace it and engage in this kind of critical dialogue. How are you going to do this if you don't have this kind of mental training.
Anyone want to take on that question?
Well, you can't. I mean, I think we're at a crossroads of how do you then convey that to the people who are in power, who make the decisions of what is valued and what is not. And so I go back to this concept of, again, public sociology and public musicology. Dr. Mack referred to, we have to give the students what they want. If the students are saying this is important to them, then this is what we have to do. And so we, as a community, need to find ways that we can teach them, but not just in the brick and mortar, ways to value the skills and the knowledge that they gain from the humanities. So going out in the public and creating discourse where the academy and society are simultaneously having a conversation together and learning from one another and understanding the value of what they're learning, which means when they come to the institution, that is going to be important to them. That is going to be why they are there. They will choose institutions that also value those things. So I think that it's very important to understand that we cannot, it's a fundamental need in our society to have what the humanities teaches us in order to have a society that is going to be great for the greater good.
Thank you. So I don't think the students don't value the humanities. I think the students value humanities music quite highly. I think the problem is what we offer. It has changed. So when I was in school and I went to various classes, I hated the grading. Because when I went to the faculty member and I said, why did I get a C? I didn't like it. What the hell does that mean? Can you show me how you got to that conclusion? And the answer was no. When I went to my chemistry professor and I said, can you show me where I got wrong? They said, oh, here, do this, do this, do this. I said, oh, okay. I could do that. I improved. If you just come back to me and go, you should have learned that then, or this, I like to read these kind of things. Can you show me with the things I like to read, how to get the conversation going? You shouldn't be reading that. Well, wait a second. How are you telling me what I like to read? I think I could still get the conversation going. I think I get all the things we're talking about going in a variety of ways. But if you can only speak to one audience, and that audience is filtering down and becoming very, very narrow, and we're getting a lot of other different people at the university, and you don't know how to talk to those people, it's not the humanities that's causing the problem. It's the fact that you can't communicate effectively with the things that they know how to do. And they're going to go elsewhere.
But if you...
I was going to say, hopefully faculty are not quite the faculty that you have.
I was hoping that was not...
I assure you that's still the case.
There may be some of those instances. You look like you were going to
Yeah, if I could jump in here. I think you're exactly right. It's talking about flexibility, and I'm going to bring in another point which really struck me in Tamika's remarks, especially. Difference. Understanding difference and speaking and hearing across difference. Those of us who teach music know how visceral and strong students' responses to music are. And especially certain genres. Like in my world, teaching country music, for example, there are many students that have they cannot remain silent. They're so incredibly wound up by hearing this. Well, that's such a powerful moment for us to say, okay, well, let's stop. Let's reflect. Like, why are we having these emotional responses? Why are you doing this? Why, right? And it's enormously productive. So I think I'm really dismayed to hear about your professor at Middlebury, because there's a difference between being able to absolutely quantify what you need to do in order to get a better grade. The humanities oftentimes don't work that way. We know that. But then there's like, I like it better or I don't like it. And it's not about that either. And it's very hard to articulate. But that's our job. So.
Should we get another question on the table, and then maybe we can kind of keep mixing it up? Sally, you had a question?
Thanks, Cynthia. I had a question I wanted to direct at Dr. Espay while you're here, and it also deals a little bit with what Dr. Mack has talked about. My area is early childhood. I teach the youngest and study the youngest learners. But I also have a background in music, a degree actually from CCM. And so when you're confronted with a difficult situation, I think what you fall back on is your training, but also what you're comfortable with. And for me, it's music. So in a room full of 3- and 4-year-olds, you might imagine some problems sometimes come up. And what I quickly found is any kind of music I can produce, a song, and I'm not a good singer, rhythms that we could tap together, immediately grabbed their attention, calmed the situation, and ultimately it became a big teaching tool for me. So what I'm really worried about is I believe we should be teaching people fully so that they can have the lives they may wish when they're adults. I think the humanities have a purpose. They don't have to yield a high-paying job. They're just very important to being a human being, which is what I think you were talking about, Tamika. But I particularly wanted to ask you, it worries me when our curriculum narrows, as it has been doing rather dramatically, because we want more mathematicians and scientists. I'm kind of scared that some of those future mathematicians and scientists may be moving in that something's happening neurologically with the music and the arts and the other things that they may not now be getting. I'm afraid we might produce fewer of them. So that, my question is there something going on here that we should be aware of?
Boy, that's a loaded question. Ultimately, so many of our experiences are in our brains, so it definitely is the case. But I think perhaps what you might have been hitting into had to do with the way in which the humanities inform the sciences, inform every kind of profession, and here inform me as a physician. I think it does, and it does in a way that I think is very powerful, because when somebody comes to me with a set of symptoms and I'm able to arrive at a diagnosis, then that person puts aside just about anything about his own self and says, what is in there for me now? What's going to happen to me? Right? And if I did not have a humanities background, I would say, well, based on what we have understood about your illness, this is what's going to happen in your future. You're going to go from this, you're considered now stage 2, we'll move on to stage 3 in the 4 years. You can make it that way, or admit that the wildest card of any of us is that which we envision for ourselves. That there aren't any absolute truths in medicine. Medicine has always been a lot of an art as much as a science, and I argue that at the time of encounters with patients is a lot more the art than the science that plays out. So I would have been driven toward thinking I know a lot about what is in the future of a patient I have just diagnosed, had it not been that not only my humanities training as well as the experience that I have kept on living with my patients, where they have always proven how little I know about them, how little I can predict about them. Right? I could say, gosh, based on all I know, this individual might progress very quickly, unfortunately. And then he says something along the lines, before me saying anything that would be so ominous. But what you're telling me is at odds with my life plan, because I want to do this and that for my grandchildren. And in fact, I will do this and that for my grandchildren. And that becomes somehow biologically powerful. It seems to happen. People who see themselves doing these kinds of things in the context of, I deal a lot with neurodegenerative diseases, seem to actually fulfill what they were planning, despite the fact that I know better that shouldn't happen, right? So it would be very, very much a loss if medicine were to be thought of completely a technical kind of endeavor and deprived from its humanities roots.
Thank you.
Hi, I want to thank all of you. This has been fascinating so far, and I just want to say, with my musicology hat on, I was sort of a student at the time of new musicology, and I observed all the enormous disagreements that went on at the time, and actually benefited because my area is music in terms of sound technologies, and we actually had to fight for the right to be able to look at the canon in terms of how it actually came about, in terms of the fact that much of that it has to do with marketing and sound recordings and why do we know these pieces but not these pieces, and why actually how did the whole popular music canon come about, which I think you alluded to a little bit, Professor Mack. You know, why do we know Led Zeppelin and not other groups? And a lot of that has to do with the whole sound technologies and the ability to be able to actually study that and talk about that. We had to fight for the right to include in musicology at the time of the new musicology discussions, let's call them, and which I think at its best, it broadened the ability to talk about music in new ways and to include whole new, in fact, popular music as part of musicology, as part of music. Let's just say, I mean, part of what I studied was what was included in music, what was allowed to be studied as music, and so I'm just going to say that I think is a very important part of this. When you looked at the music in the middle, what did that actually mean? You know, what was the study of music? And now, music technologies is a huge area and burgeoning in many universities, which is one of the reasons why I think music actually is a growing field in some ways. With my other hat on, music as a librarian, this actually has a completely different and very, very profound implication, what we're talking about today. Because this decanonization, when you look at it as data points in terms of what people are accessing in the libraries, and that is then used in terms of what we actually keep in libraries, what we actually store in libraries, whether we value still print materials at all, is actually extremely important. And whether we continue to study the canon, whether we continue to value, say, well, we need to be a scientist. I actually need a liberal arts education, and it means that I need to have I need to be able to explore these things and find them in a library, where there's some points of view that say, if that item is available in 100 million libraries, then we don't need to store it in this one. So you can order it and you'll get it in a week or 10 days. Well, in students who want to have instant access, they're not going to wait for 10 days, and that's just going to really change the way that things are studied, the way that things are available. So it actually, how do we invest in our libraries as the core of what we think about? So I wanted to bring that into the discussion because it's actually really, really important in our libraries right now, what we're talking about. What are we keeping? What are we actually not keeping?
Comments? More questions? We can just keep raising some questions. I see a couple of hands up. You and then you. Come back to you.
Thank you. I would like to thank you all. I teach beginning Spanish, and I'm also a painter, and part of these questions come up also. This might not matter to a lot of people, but my husband is African American. We've been married for over 30 years, and I have 3 kids. So their life has been different, and I grew up in a small town of 3,000 people. So some of the questions are things that have been lived in my family. But my main question is, where does the online issue come in when we're teaching? Because in my field, when you have things available online, there's a lot of things that are available to people. But if all of your classes are online, it seems to me there can be this implicit idea that there's one right answer, and that sometimes what's being measured, I can absolutely say this, that 25% of the class that I'm teaching, and I don't make the syllabus, is a flat out A for everybody, because all you have to do is Google the answer and you don't have to know what you're doing. But more broadly, it wouldn't have to be that way. I didn't set it up, okay. But what happens when we don't know each other because people don't get together? When you don't know people, if you never rub shoulders with them, if you stay in your own comfort zone, what do you learn when you ask questions, when you hear other people's questions, when you make mistakes? And that's okay, because we want you to learn the process and you learn how to communicate. And I got a whole lot of pushback and was told that I needed to be quiet. I'd already said my piece, but I want to make sure that students have opportunities where they're around other people, they get in some good arguments, they hear the arguments that they didn't grow up with, they heard something else, they're never going to be exposed to them. They start seeing other people and ideas as being something that enriches their thinking and their mind, and it's not going to happen as long as you stay in your little comfort zone and you accept this is what it is and nobody questions. And you all made wonderful points about that, and I'm just concerned, like, if everything's online, what's the implicit thing? There's one right answer, or you can Google it, so you really don't need to know anything. And then when you don't know what you don't know, so you can't even ask it, but then you learn to communicate, and in the meantime you hear ideas from other people. And I'd like to know from you, I talked too long, but where do you see that coming in?
I can take this down. So I'll tell you a story about something that happened. It happened about 5 years ago. So I'm an organic chemist by training, and one of the things that I was beat into is studying a table, and the table was called the pKa table. It's about how acidic something is or basic something isn't, and you had to have rote memory of doing that. And I got trained to do it. You spit out a molecule, and it's 20. You just had to do it. And then I made my students do it, and then they had to do it. And then one of the students, about 5 years ago, they were doing a presentation inside our group. We have group meetings, and I asked them about a conversion. And chemists use something called kilocalories, just like the calorie you go on it. And physicists do not like kilocalories, they use kilojoules. This is a big thing, and there's a conversion. 4.184 kilojoules is 1 kilocalorie. You had to know. That was an examination. You didn't know that. What kind of chemist were you if you could not speak both languages? So, student did not know. I said, oh my goodness, what? No, you have to know. 4.184. She said, why would I need to know it? I can Google it. So I went and I asked my phone, Siri, how many kilojoules is in a kilocalorie? Siri said, 4.184 kilojoules in 1 kilocalorie. So I said, do you have to know that? So then I said, why did I ever have to know that? So we had to have a discussion. So we took the time that day to have a discussion about why I needed to know that and if that's still true. So I got my degree in 2000. She got her degree in 2016. So then I went backwards from 2000 to 84. I said, well, what did they need to know in 84 that I didn't need to know? And would I need to know that in 84? So the point was, I didn't fight the technology. I said, okay, that's what we have. So now if this resource is online, then how would I recreate a new group meeting? How would I recreate a new whatever in order to take that into account and then develop the next stage ahead? Because that's the evolutionary process, and that's what's going to happen. So my guess is you go from 84 and you go back to 68, I guess, right? Then you would just keep going backwards and say, yeah, that's always going to be the case. And then it came through what the only reason why I made them do it is because I had to do it. And that wasn't good enough for them. And then we got to that conclusion, and I don't make them do it anymore. And I'm terrified, right? I'm terrified someone's going to ask them, what's the conversion factor? They're not going to know. It's going to look really bad on me, and they're going to hate me for it, and what kind of person. But that's what we have to do.
So Linsky writes, as technology advances, then so will our culture. As technology advances, then so will our culture. It brings me back to the original canon and how, as our culture changed, so did the canon. And so it then began to be more multicultural, more multiracial, and inclusive of the world in which we lived. And now in some spaces that was valued, in other spaces it would not. But as society changes, so will how we do things. And so I think that that's important to sort of hold on to. I don't want to get into a larger conversation about the value of online education versus the value of a traditional brick and mortar, but I do know that as our society changes, we as a people have to do things that also change with us, unless we want to get left behind. And so that's not saying denouncing one over the other, but that's just saying let's figure out how we can do things differently to not cater necessarily, but to recognize and honor that things are changing.
Thank you. So you had a question in there?
Thank you very much, everyone. This has been really thought-provoking. Thanks for your talk, Stephen, and all your comments. You started by bringing up the idea of canonization in relation to community, which is something, the kind of relationship there I wanted to think through. Canons are sort of by nature exclusive. They're like the exclusive works, but they're also exclusionary. And the example of like Led Zeppelin versus Public Enemy, that's like a great, where it's like, which community are you in, inside or outside? That's a good example of that. But then canons do also create a kind of community. They give us a common language, and the 4.184, you have to know that to be a chemist, right? That's like the canon, the canonical knowledge of being a chemist. And you brought up the idea of like a public musicology, which is a great notion. And especially the idea that musicology can create the kind of public, that we all kind of share these tastes, or we have these common reference, that we can be not just in a level playing field, but like actually in the same playing field, and not in a bunch of different fields. So it's a tough question, to what extent canon is involved in that, and if we're going to be a multicultural institution, how can we have a canon? Because does that imply the creation of a culture? So is it a matter of just having a more diverse canon, or doing away with the idea of canonization altogether, and what would be the effects of that? And thinking through what that means in a neoliberal university, like, are we a learning community? Is that what a university is? Or are we a business? Is that what a university is? Yes. Right? That's a question for us. And so our teachers, are we part of this community, or are we alienated labor? Are we adjuncts who are here for a year, or not here, we don't know how long we're here, or are we underpaid and we can't afford to live in the same places where we work? Are students alienated from each other? Do they actually know each other or not? I don't know, it's a real question, I think, about what a canon does for community and what that means for what we're trying to do here. And even sort of bridging the gap between academia and the community in which we all live and work. how is knowledge a part of defining those boundaries, but also welcoming each other into relationships? That's what this made me think of.
I have a response to that. These are, I have a response, not answers. My response is focused on the question of what to give up. So the idea of the expansion of the canon, I think, was something along the lines of what you're talking about. Okay, we want to have a more diverse and inclusive environment. Therefore, let's put Public Enemy and Led Zeppelin and Miles Davis into the canon so we can listen to Public Enemy, Miles Davis, Led Zeppelin, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Bill Monroe, yeah, right? We just put it all in there, and then we'll create this kind of inclusive space. The problem is it didn't work like that. That people that loved, Schumann's Dichterliebe said, I cannot possibly imagine any canon that does not include Schumann's Dichterliebe. Oh yeah, well it's okay, we can have Public Enemy too. That's okay, but you keep my Dichterliebe, right? So then eventually you end up with the Norton Anthology of Western Music, which is, literally 2,500 pages long. It's not there. It's no longer a canon in any functional sense because it's too big for people to actually connect to in that way. So I think we have to always ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up? It's like, well, you know what? I hope that you like Dichterliebe. I hope you end up loving it, but for this purpose, I'm putting it aside. It's not as important as Bill Monroe or Miles Davis in this particular situation. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value, but that's the step that's so difficult for us to take, because in the humanities we all feel so, and I'm in a privileged position because I have a tenured position. I'm totally privileged, I understand that, and yet I feel beleaguered, let alone untenured faculty, let alone contingent faculty, let alone my graduate students. I feel that way. So in that environment, asking any of us to kind of give up these things feels like sort of an assault on our justification, on our being. So it becomes very, very difficult. Yeah.
I have a question here next.
This is more of an observation. Much of the discussion of this type focuses on how the sciences, students and teachers of science, may benefit from exposure to the humanities. But I would like to observe from my own experience that the sciences also have something that is, humans have something to benefit from exposure to the sciences, especially in my own field, in the study of vernacular and folk musics, the field of experimental psychology, theories of memory, theories of the cognitive sciences, especially as they apply to the field of linguistics. These all have very important consequences for the students who want to know what makes things work. Now that's not going to apply to all students. It takes a certain kind of curiosity. But the question, what makes things work, in the field of music often benefits from the study of the parallel fields of especially the cognitive sciences and experimental psychology.
We have time for a couple more comments.
I don't know how to have that first. Well, my comment has to do with, since you are leaving right now,
So in this fantastically invigorating conversation, one of the most important points was your first observation, this is a new conversation to me. That if you were the only one who hasn't had this conversation, it says something about how the university is structured and which disciplines are somehow exempt from this. That if you don't have to defend your value every day, that's just going to be your job. But I'd also say that I think there is a conversation like this in your field, but somehow you can do your job without being part of the discussion, because clearly people are knocking on your door all the time. I mean, not your, well, physically too, but also metaphorically. So that's just the observation. I think that says something about how we need to make sure that we don't build divisions among us. We are all part of this university. We all need each other, right? So we should not start fighting with each other for resources. We should all be happy for each other. But that was so another point about, so now we'll let you go. About the canon, I mean, so in my field, in fact, Tamika is my academic child, one of my slides, but I teach the canon of sociology, sociological theory. The first paper that we read is why is classical sociology classical? That is, it's a critical take on canon building, which is in fact precisely what Tamika was talking about, an effort to build, to create status, to build a discipline, to carve out space for us, and to create sort of, you know, on dubious grounds perhaps, a science connection that sort of enhances our stature. But of course, it is a project, it's a construction. We use the canon more like you do, your 4.1 above, is something you need to know. It doesn't play a particularly active role, except perhaps Marx, that to be we have to do. But so canons also, it's just to confirm that canon also serve very exclusionary purposes, and perhaps we can do our jobs without a canon, possibly.
Was there another question? Yeah, well, actually, I was also because I'm really, really interested in neurology, and I've read more than most historians read about the brain in the last, 10 years or so. But the doctor had his badge MD, and even the chemist, with 100% placement rate for students. One of the things that, and I, like you, went to a liberal arts college in New England, a long, long time ago, but one of the things that's, and I know we're very, very large, but one of the things that I thought was a little counter-intellectual or sort of counterintuitive about our college being divided into David, I know had to leave, but like he's the Associate Dean for Humanities, when history is often in the social sciences and not in the humanities. Not that that matters, except that where I got my PhD at Berkeley, there's a whole lot more money in that College of Social Sciences than there is in history. Than there is in humanities, and economics is in that college as well, right? So I just think that and then we have the natural sciences, and we have Jennifer with social sciences, that really, I think it's, even though we do such different things, I think it's so important that we learn from one another. So structurally and administratively in this university and in my college, we don't do that, except when we're on like director of graduate studies or heads, or you're on the college RPT committee. And the thing is that there's so much value in understanding certain things about the practical nature of producing, whether it's an article, a book, or a grant. What your lifeline is, your lifeblood are grants. Okay, so we can learn from those kinds of things. And I think why chemists come out understanding things about literature of all kinds out of Middlebury or Mount Holyoke or Smith is because you do it there, right? Mm-hmm. But the size of those places help. And they don't have graduate students, right, for the most part. But I still think that it's, I've always been interested, like the class I'm teaching now, as a historian, works on the British Empire and comparative Europe. I've been asked me to teach a class called Staging History. And it's about Hamilton and Angels in America. Because in another lifetime ago, I gave up being an actress and a director to become a historian. But also, I love it because these 36 students are from all different disciplines. And fewer and fewer of my classes seem to be like that. Those are the classes that really interest me, is what they can offer the students from DAP, the sociologists, the students indeed from CCM, I have, two, they write beautifully, my chemists in this class. So it's that kind of thing that I just think you see, we're not getting any closer to that from my many years here. We're going further and further apart. And I'm with Anna that we can't just fight for resources as disciplines, I mean, remember what disciplines are. It's about discipline. Discipline, there's a real negative thing to that, kind of, I think it's worth considering. But I also thought this was really, wonderfully enlightening and helpful, so I thank you all.
Well, I love the fact that you're helping us end on a note of creativity, interdisciplinarity, and also just a call to continue to work together. And I think that's one of the things that all the panelists have talked about, this idea of not staying within our walls, maybe breaking them down, listening to each other. And I really appreciate that all of us have done this here today. I very much thank the panelists and Stephen Meyer for kicking us off. So thank you to Stephen Meyer, to Tamika Odum, to James Mack, to Rebecca Williamson, to Alberto Espay, who had to leave. But thank you to all of you for your comments, your willingness to listen and not throw chairs. It is very much appreciated. So I also want to thank very briefly again the committee members who helped to get us to this point. And a big thank you, as I said, to you as the audience. If you want to share this information with your colleagues to continue to promote discussion, feel free to do so. We have the wonderful work of the folks here who have been taping and videotaping us. So this will be available at www.libraries.uc.edu just as soon as possible. I did want to mention as well that if you want to continue the conversation on the humanities and higher education, consider attending tomorrow's Taft Center lecture. It is entitled Humanities Education at the Crossroads, Why the Liberal Arts Are Fundamental to Democracy. And that's presented by William Egginton at 3 o'clock at the Taft Research Suite at 1 Edwards Center. So once again, thank you very much for coming, and if we could have one final round of applause.
I still have so much to say.